Good evening. I'm Todd Lefkoe, chairperson of East-West Connections. This is the second of our 12-part series on Minnesota's influence in international affairs. I wish to thank our co-sponsors, the Museum of Russian Art, the Minnesota Committee on Foreign Relations, the Russian Studies Department of Macalester College in Zerkalo, the Russian Media in Minnesota. I also wish to thank Sofia Shamayel for her technical support and our wonderful presenters. But most of all, I want to thank you, our viewers. The recording of tonight's program will appear on our YouTube channels as well as our social media outlets. I am honored to introduce the initiator and developer of the series, the wonderful Bernadine Jocelyn. Take it away.
Well, thank you, Todd. Hello, everybody. Good evening. We're so glad you've joined us tonight. As Todd said, I'm Bernadine Jocelyn, and on behalf of East-West Connections, it's my honor and my privilege to serve as moderator for tonight's webinar, which, as Todd said, is the second in a series that we're hosting on exploring Minnesota's unique contributions to international affairs. Tonight, our topic is, why has Minnesota fostered so many international human rights organizations? And we have a really wonderful group of presenters that are going to be with us tonight. I did want to let folks know that we are recording this session. As Todd says, this session will be available on our website afterwards, where you can also find recordings of past sessions that we've done. And we invite you to visit us there at eastwestconnections.org. We were inspired to host this series and tonight's webinar in particular about Minnesota's deep involvement in humanitarian work worldwide, because we have a unique history in our state of being a destination for refugees and immigrants, and having a really strong international culture for a little state that sits in the middle of the country, bordering Canada, far to either coast. We've got all kinds of organizations here in Minnesota. We're going to hear from some of them tonight: Alight, Advocates for Human Rights, and Global Volunteers. And we've long been focused on humanitarianism in our state and strengthening international connections. The other thing that's really unique about Minnesota's connection to global affairs is that being home to these organizations offers Minnesotans uniquely an accessible way to become involved in this type of work. And we'll be hearing a little bit more about those kind of opportunities here tonight. Unfortunately, from our perspective at East-West Connections, the history of these organizations and Minnesota's unique global atmosphere, something in the water here, is pretty poorly known, even by Minnesotans. And so we decided to do something about it by hosting this webinar series and inviting these wonderful guests to be with us here tonight. We're going to hear from each of our three presenters in turn, and then we'll open up our meeting for your questions and comments. So please do, throughout the evening, feel free to drop any comments or questions in the chat box, and we'll have an opportunity to address them at the end. And as we settle in here, just to kind of get a sense of who's in the room with us, so to speak, our virtual room, I invite folks to drop into the chat where they're joining us from tonight. It's interesting to see where our audience is from. I'm joining from Grand Rapids, Minnesota, which is near the headwaters of the Mississippi River. So we're going to first hear tonight from Aidan Johnson, and I'm going to just say a few words of introduction to Aidan. He was born and raised in Minnesota like me, a native Minnesotan, and he holds a bachelor's, a BA in political science from the University of Minnesota, which I'm also an alum. And Aidan has earned an LLM in international human rights from the University of Galway. Before joining Alight, Aidan worked in campaign politics, in community organizing, and human rights research. He works to encourage community involvement in private sponsorship for refugee resettlement. We're so pleased to have you with us tonight. Thank you, Aidan. And we're really interested to hear about the story of why and how Alight came to be here in Minnesota. Thanks for joining us, Aidan. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be a part of this tonight. So I have just started to share my screen. Hopefully everyone can see that. Great, I'm seeing thumbs up. So yeah, again, so Thanks so much. I'm really excited to be part of this conversation on what makes Minnesota such a uniquely welcoming and influential place. And I'm really looking forward to hear from Jennifer and Michelle later on. But in the meantime, I'm really excited to introduce you to Alight and talk a little bit about our history. Alight, Alight began its journey. We began our journey in 1979, sort of with this enduring belief in the power of the possible and the abundance of everyday people. And today we are a borderless organization with over 2,500 staff around the world working with and alongside over 4 million people experiencing displacement. And we were formerly known as the American Refugee Committee, name changed in 2019. And I'll talk a little bit about that when I get into some brief history here. So in 1978, our founder, Neil Ball, initiated efforts in Chicago, actually, to reunite refugee families and provide the sponsorship necessary for refugees approved for third country resettlement to come to the US, and found a lot of success doing that. And in that success, found a lot of interest in leveraging the efforts of individuals in providing sponsorship to refugees. So Neil then started looking around for folks that he could partner with and do this in a more permanent, institutional, full-time fashion. And he found that with our first executive director, Stan Breen, and worked with him to formalize that work. And so Sam Breen actually worked here in Minnesota in Governor Wendell Anderson's administration, and was involved in resettlement here, but was also a key advocate and voice in the passage of the 1980 Refugee Act, which formally brought the US into compliance with the 1951 Refugee Convention. So, we can see just in that history alone, the way that Minnesota's progressive work dating back to the mid 20th century and prior was essential in the establishment of Alight, as it served as sort of a magnet to bring folks from elsewhere to do this work. And now, over 40 years later, we are working all over the world, partnering with people and organizations in the communities we serve to make an impact. And we do a broad range of different work, managing refugee camps, humanitarian response. We have some great programming in creating women and girls centers in South Sudan to serve as sanctuary spaces for those vulnerable to gender-based violence. We do work in El Salvador, fostering access to computers and maker spaces and community service projects for young folks there. And so much more all across the world. We are truly a global organization that does a lot more than you might think of when you hear that we work with displaced people. And in the last 40 years since our founding, we've evolved, including a pretty big rebrand and name switch in 2019, into an organization that really aims to reflect our values, these values that you see on the screen. And those values, I think, are really informed by our roots here in Minnesota, really trying to leverage the core and fundamental characteristics of our community as welcoming, as understanding, as progressive, and that's that every human being is full and whole and complex and worthy of truly being seen. And this is a great point for me to get at where our name change comes from, as we know that the people we work with are so much more than just refugees, and we want our name to reflect both the diversity of the work that we do and the complexity of the folks that we do that work with. And so at Alight, we don't refer to the people we serve as beneficiaries. They are customers, and we work for them. We believe that their lived experience renders them subject matter experts, and we put co-creation at the center of our process, trying to design solutions to include and benefit everyone. And that work extends here in the US as well. So we began our journey doing work here in the US back in 1979, before branching out to other areas of the world and actually closing down our US-based programming for a while. But recently, we've reopened and reemphasized our US programming by directly serving newcomers along their journey helping to meet families' basic needs, easing the isolation and loneliness that comes along with resettlement. We offer dignified resources and programming worthy of our newcomers' humanity. And we also help to facilitate connections and community among all stakeholders. So bringing people with varied lived experiences, cultures, and backgrounds together. And we help to build the networks that unlock new opportunities for everyone. And we also do work here building the welcoming capacity of others. So in a really wonderful full circle moment, we have had the chance to build up our US-based programming, starting with refugee resettlement in the late 70s and 80s, and then coming back to refugee resettlement and private sponsorship here today through a couple of different pathways, but through Uniting for Ukraine, and also through a new program called Welcome Corps that allows us to welcome newcomers from all over the world. And so, we're here again trying to break down the barriers for folks to be resettled in our community. And this is the program that I work on specifically, so it's very near and dear to my heart. And to date, we have supported over 150 sponsor groups across the country since we've reopened our US programming, as they've welcomed hundreds of refugees. And it's been really incredible to do this work, leading from Minnesota and extending our values across the country, really sharing a culture of inclusivity and trying to always bring our best and most welcoming energy to the table. This work, as I mentioned, takes place through a couple of different pathways. And those have been really incredible, allowing individuals to form groups and welcome refugees from all around the world who have been approved for resettlement. So I think, what I've seen in doing this work, community organizing, is just the tremendous sense of community and welcoming that Minnesotans bring. That's why Minnesota for Alight. That's how we ended up here in the first place, not maybe starting in Minnesota, but very quickly realizing that Minnesota was the right place to build this because the community was so strong here. And then using Minnesota and Minnesotan values and sort of this culture that we bring to the table, and extending that all over the world. It's been really incredible over the course of 40 years. And obviously I haven't been with the organization for 40 years, but it's been really great seeing how that's being leveraged in our communities today. And I would be remiss in this moment to not share that we're always looking for volunteers to step up and do this work with us. So in good community organizing fashion, I'll leave you with that ask. Our contact info is here. But this is a really fantastic conversation, and I'm glad that Alight has the opportunity to be part of it. I wish that we had somebody on from our founding days who could speak a little bit more to the detail of the history, because there is obviously so much there. We're really fortunate that we've got folks on this call who are going to be able to give a little bit more of that detailed history from our other organizations. But I thought that this was a really wonderful opportunity to tie sort of our roots to our present, and talk about how we're leveraging those values that make Minnesota so great and give us such an outsized influence internationally, and how that's being operationalized today. So with that, I'll just say thank you, and I will yield my time.
Wow, Aiden, thank you so much for that. When your comment about how one of the founders who had been working for then Governor Wendell Anderson and sort of the political climate here reminded me of the story we heard in our first webinar. And I really commend our viewers tonight to check that out. The story about the Defense Language Institute and how that was founded in the wake of the internment camps for Japanese Americans. And at the time they were in California, and they needed to move to a community or place that was free of that racial prejudice that was so pervasive in the West Coast at the time. They came to Minnesota. So it's a similar story to what you shared. Thank you so much, Aiden, for that.
Thank you.
We're going to turn now to hear next from Jennifer Presthold. Thank you, Jennifer, for being with us tonight. Jennifer is Deputy Director of Advocates for Human Rights. And in that role, she assists in fundraising for and directing the organization's operations. She also directs the International Justice Program, supervising the organization's advocacy at the United Nations and regional human rights mechanisms, as well as the Nepal School Project. Maybe we'll get to hear a little bit about that today. Prior to becoming deputy director, Jennifer practiced asylum law for 7 years and directed the organization's refugee and immigrant program, where she specialized in gender-based asylum claims. Jennifer has an expertise in women's human rights, minority rights, LGBTIQ+ rights, refugee and immigrant rights, as well as transitional justice and peace building in post-conflict settings. She's led international human rights fact-finding trips in Africa, Asia, and South America, and has trained women human rights defenders from more than 20 countries. She has a BA in political science from Yale, a master's of arts and law and diplomacy from the Fletcher School at Tufts University, where I hoped to go to school, but never made it there, Jennifer. At Fletcher, she studied international human rights and refugee policy and graduated cum laude from the University of Minnesota Law School. So we are really privileged and delighted to have you with us tonight, Jennifer. Thank you so much. Over to you.
Thanks, Bernadine. It's a pleasure to be here and to learn a little bit more from Aidan about Alight. Alight's been a great colleague organization for many, many years, and I look forward to hearing from Michelle as well. So as you can see from the slide, it is the Advocates' 40th anniversary year. And actually earlier this week was the official 40th, when the date that we were incorporated in here in the great state of Minnesota. So I have not been with the I've been with the organization a long time, but not that long. So I will do my best to pass along what I know about the early days. The vision, thanks, Sophia, you can go to the next slide. The vision of the Advocates really is a world where every person can live with dignity, freedom, justice, equality, and peace. And these are really if you boil international human rights law down into 5 words, this is our interpretation of it. These are the things the interconnected rights that everyone needs in order to live the fullest life possible. So that's our goal. One thing that's unique about the Advocates for Human Rights as an international human rights organization is that we do work locally as well as globally. So it's sort of, year by year, sometimes it's half and half. It sort of depends on the projects, but you don't see that a lot, at least with international human rights organizations. A lot of times they're working either just on the local or national level or on just on the international. Next slide, please. Another way that, let's see, Sophia, next slide, please. Another way that the Advocates is unique as a human rights organization, although as Aidan was saying, not as a international organization, is that we're a volunteer-based organization, and we believe that everyone has the power to advance human rights. And so engaging volunteers and hands-on human rights work really is a way to grow the international human rights movement, and also to transform the lives of the individuals who are our volunteers. And I did notice that Sarah Musgrave is participating. Sarah is a longtime and really valued volunteer. Has done a lot of different kinds of work for us, and is a very wonderful presence in the office as well. But this is a photo from the Nepal school, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But I don't have a lot of photos. I just wanted to highlight that. Next slide, please. And then I'll also just add that we're in the process of doing our audit, and so we're kind of tallying our in-kind and pro bono contributions. So I just got the report today that in fiscal year 23 we had more than 1,400 volunteers who contributed more than $17 million in-kind and pro bono services. So that's a lot, and I do think that is only possible in a place like Minnesota. Even though our volunteers are everywhere, the being based here has made that, and having a lot of volunteers here has made that possible. Next slide. So our strategic priorities, we can actually just skip on to the next slide. A lot of our work in the early days was very project-based, but and as time has gone on, we have built out some of those projects. So one that I wanted to highlight is migrant rights. So our work there is to protect the dignity in migration and also in immigration policy. But one of the early projects of the advocates was the Asylum Project, which is now our refugee and immigrant program, and we serve more than 3,000 individuals last year in their asylum cases, as well as youth that are escaping from labor trafficking. So that's been, since the very beginning, a group of immigration attorneys came to us, local immigration attorneys came to us and said, there's this real need. We'll help you train volunteer attorneys to handle these cases. So my start at the organization was in that program. At that point, there were, I think, 2 staff, and we now have 15 in that program. So in part in response to the tremendous demand, but also in part to serving needs that are unmet. For example, in North Dakota and South Dakota in our service area, there just are very few resources. Another area that has been part of the organization for quite a long time is our women's human rights program. So we're working to end violence against women and girls. We have a project called the Watch Project that some of you may be familiar with. That was originally another Minnesota organization that combined with us now probably 4 or 5 years ago, but that stands for Women at the Courthouse. And so we engage volunteers to go and monitor. This is a core human rights principle, or human rights monitoring tool, but we engage volunteers to go and monitor in the courtrooms in Hennepin, Ramsey, and Washington counties, violence against women cases. So that's been a really important piece of it. And then our women's rights program is also working with human rights defenders, primarily in Eastern Europe and former Soviet republics in that region. I'll just kind of quickly go through a couple of other things that I would really emphasize. We've been working to abolish the death penalty. Earlier in the organization's time, we were representing individuals on death row in their appeals. That has really changed to now we're focusing globally, and this is a real bright spot actually in the human rights world today, that the rest of the world is making significant progress in abolishing the death penalty. So about 4 countries have abolished the death penalty just in the past year. Ghana has recently moved to abolish the death penalty. It's sitting on the president's desk waiting to be signed. So that's something we're on the steering committee of the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty, and a lot of our international advocacy right now is related to that, because we're seeing such a huge impact in that area. But the advocates has something called special consultative status at the United Nations that allows us to participate in the human rights mechanisms there. So that's a big piece of our work as well. Trafficking, I mentioned the direct services for youth who have experienced labor trafficking. We also have an upcoming report on sex trafficking in Minnesota. This is a revision of a report that we did about 10 years ago. So look for that to come soon. And just to kind of highlight a Minnesota thing about trafficking, we do a lot of work with the Minnesota Department of Health, because in Minnesota, human trafficking is treated as a public health and safety issue. And so we've been doing a lot of legislative work to get laws passed to better protect individuals who are survivors of trafficking. The Nepal School is actually our smallest project. It's one that I oversee, and it is a school that was founded in 1999 in partnership with a community in the rural Kathmandu Valley. And the goal is to provide an alternative to child labor by providing high quality education. And we've just seen a dramatic impact in that one community. We serve now 375 students in pre-K through 10th grade. And I'm very excited to be able to go back. I haven't been to Nepal since late 2019, and so I'll be going with a team in early December. So very excited to do that. And we have an event next week on October 17th. If you want to learn more about that, it's a virtual event as well, and so we'll be giving an update on the school. And then just, very, very briefly, the diaspora engagement, I think, is something else that's unique about our organization. We work with organizations that are in diaspora as well as our clients to amplify their voices, particularly in our international advocacy. And this is because there are many countries in the world where it's too dangerous to speak out. And so it really is up to the individuals who are outside of the country to raise the issues and report on what's happening, so that there can be pressure from the international community for change. LGBTIQ plus rights are a really important priority for us as well, both in our asylum legal services and also in our advocacy. And we work with a number of different human rights defender partners in countries like Kenya, Russia, Cameroon, in that work. And then finally, transitional justice is an area where we've done a couple of very interesting projects. Our biggest, we worked under a memorandum of understanding with the Liberian Truth and Reconciliation Commission to bring their process outside of the subregion of West Africa. And so we took more than 1,600 statements from Liberians here in Minnesota. Well, our initial thought was that we will just do this in Minnesota, which has the largest Liberian population outside of the subregion of West Africa. But then they asked us to expand. So we covered the United States. We were working in 8 US cities, as well as a number of cities in Europe, and then a refugee camp called Bujumbura in Ghana. So I like to I like to call this project my fourth and most problematic child, but it's now been 10 years. But we took more than 1,600 statements, held the first public hearings of any Truth Commission outside of their country. We held those at Hamline University in St. Paul, the whole week, brought the entire Truth Commission over, and then wrote a 400-page report on the experiences of Liberians who had to flee from, and that's a voice that would not have been included if we hadn't worked with the TRC to do that. So next slide. So just to give you a little bit of history on the Advocates, we were founded in 1983. The original name was the Minnesota Lawyers International Human Rights Committee, or MLURC, which seemed a little unfortunate to me as who wasn't there at the time. But we were founded by a group of Minnesota lawyers who really saw the opportunity to make a change in the world. And so some of them are people that are familiar. Don Frazier, who was a former mayor of Minneapolis and member of Congress, as well as Sam Heinz and Barbara Fry, who went on to be the executive director for 15 years of the Advocates, and then to teach human rights and create the human rights program at the University of Minnesota. And then David Weisbrot, who was one of my mentors and part of the reason that I'm in Minnesota. And he was a professor at the University of Minnesota Law School, created the human rights program there, and was really one of those people that was known worldwide. If you mentioned that you were from Minnesota, people would say, "Oh, do you know David?" So the one name like Beyonce or Prince, that's who he was in the international human rights community. We changed our name in 1992 to Minnesota Advocates for Human Rights, and so I still sometimes hear people referring to us as that. And then in 2008, we changed the name again to the Advocates for Human Rights to better reflect our global mission. So I'll stop there and look forward to questions.
Jennifer, thank you so much. I had a couple of personal connections to your story. My dad, my darling dad, who's been dead now 10 years, was a volunteer with Watch. And he
Mhm.
would go with those red clipboards and
We
go
still use the red clipboards. Yeah.
into courtrooms. Yes,
Yeah.
yes. So,
Yeah, no,
and Don
that's great.
Fraser, yeah, and Don Fraser, whom you mentioned, how interesting to hear that, because Don was also a founding member on the board of directors of US-USSR Connect. And we heard from them in the inaugural webinar last week from Susan Hartman, also a founding member of an organization, you know, created to help create bridges between cultures. So thank you so much for your remarks. We're going to turn now and hear from Michelle Gran. Thank you, Michelle, for being with us tonight. Michelle is also a native Minnesotan, born and raised in St. Paul, Minnesota, and co-founder of Global Volunteers that we're going to hear from tonight. Michelle serves on the board of directors, and she initiates and directs the organization's community mental wellness initiative for the Reaching Children's Potential program. And she has directed volunteer engagement at Global Volunteers for 38 years. She also does media relations and marketing strategies. She somehow kept up with all the development in social media. And for someone from our generation, Michelle, a nod to you, a bow of respect for that. And she's in charge of all the messaging on all the major channels and videos for the organization. She's got a master's degree in liberal studies from Hamline University and a bachelor's journalism from Aiden and my alma mater, the University of Minnesota. I would just add that she has led volunteer teams on over 80 global volunteer service programs around the world. Thank you, Michelle, for being with us tonight. Over to you.
Well, thank you, Bernadine. And I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to speak with everybody. Thank you, Jennifer and Aiden as well. It was just so interesting to listen to what you have to say. As Bernadine said, I am a co-founder with my husband, Bud Philbrook. We are about to celebrate our 40th anniversary. The purpose of Global Volunteers is really very simple, and that's to enable volunteers to help nurture and sustain the well-being of the world's children, because we want children to be able to reach their full human potential. We think that that's a human right. And so we engage volunteers, specifically short-term volunteers, to do that. Next slide, please. So why do we focus on children? Well, quite simply, children are our future. It sounds trite to say that, but it is foundational. But at the same time, they're among the most vulnerable populations, sadly, on the planet. But when we invest in children, they produce lifelong impacts. And so, but the other side of that is that they also experience disproportionately violence and suffering around the world, which is what makes them so vulnerable. Next slide, please. Our volunteers are renewable resources, infinitely renewable resources. We rely on them, our not so secret ingredient, to provide a renewable source of skills, energy, and encouragement to local communities. To date, we've mobilized over 37,000 team members on service programs worldwide. Next slide. What we do is really can be divided in these four main areas. There you go. Thank you. We have to make it easy for our team members who commit from 1 to 3 weeks at a time of service. So we divide these work projects into areas that are familiar to people, and that is what you're seeing on the screen there. We deliver essential services. We support community development. We teach conversational English, and we supplement school-based curricula. Next slide, please. Okay, so at the base of this is our philosophy of service, which my husband, Bud Philbrook, developed as he was finishing up his degree in public affairs at the Humphrey Institute, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But briefly, we only serve where we're invited. We only work under the direction of local leaders. Only on community-based projects that they identify specifically for us. We only do what we're asked to do. We don't come with our own agenda, of course. And then we work alongside local people on all of the projects. Local people are always in charge of our service programs. Next slide, please. Where do we do this? Again, we are a worldwide organization, and you can see yourself the expanse of the work projects. Over the years, we have worked in 34 countries on 6 continents, in 200 partner communities. Right now, we currently sustain 14 programs around the world, and we have earned special consultative status with the United Nations back in 1989. Next slide, please. Okay, so our origin history. So I am happy to say I have been with the organization from the very first day. What you really need to know is that it was on our honeymoon, my husband's and my honeymoon in Conacaste, Guatemala in 1979. We negotiated with a development organization called the Institute of Cultural Affairs to work as short-term volunteers on their service project or their program in Conacaste, Guatemala. We were the first to do so because up until that time, it was only their staff and volunteers who committed at least 2 years of their lives. But because of my husband's work, as I said, with the Humphrey Institute of Public Affairs, and he was a state legislator at the time, we were permitted to spend a week on this project. And as a result of my academic connections with journalists, my graduate degree is in journalism. I mean, my undergraduate degree. We ended up on the B section of what was then the Star newspaper. Some of you may remember the Star. It was the afternoon newspaper in Minneapolis. And many people who read the article and contacted Bud and I, it really inspired Bud to consider starting a nonprofit organization to enable other socially motivated boomers, because we are, by the way, boomers, to do what we did. So as it says there, we are really rooted in the social justice movement of the time, and tried to leverage what we knew to create this very ambitious project at the time. And Todd was one of those very founding, he's on our board of trustees and was a founding member of Global Volunteers. That was the beginning. Next slide. So what was happening at that time? You can go on to the next slide, because this will give you a little bit of history of what was actually happening that gave rise to all of this. You probably remember it was the era of a vast number of Cambodian and Vietnamese refugees that were escaping the brutal siege of communism in Southeast Asia. So many of the people of my generation were motivated to try to do something personally in solidarity of those who were being displaced and persecuted. So we founded Global Volunteers in 1984. Now you'll notice the previous slide talked about 1979, and that was when our honeymoon was in, as I said, in Conacaste, Guatemala. It was an effort for Bud and I to experience the developing world together. And it was a remarkable project where we both did independent work. I worked on with the Institute of Cultural Affairs, which had this project in Conacaste, Guatemala. It was one of their many service programs, but they only worked with, as I had said, staff and local people, long-serving local volunteers. So I helped them with a brochure to help explain to potential benefactors what they were trying to accomplish. And then Bud worked on a trickle irrigation project that they had just started. And so we, in some ways, helped them realize the value of short-term volunteers, which was something that was a perfectly new concept for them. And they were just really indulging our interest to see if we could experiment what it would be like to engage short-term volunteers to do that type of work. So we founded, along, as I said, with Todd, back in 1984, then skip ahead from 79 when we had this experience to 84. It took a while to put a board of directors together and to create the organizational structure. And so then each year for the next 3 years, our numbers, our volunteer numbers doubled. We basically started out with friends and relatives. Todd was on the very first service program we ever sent to Jamaica, again underneath the auspices of the Institute of Cultural Affairs. And then we just continued to grow beyond that and expand to other countries, including Tanzania very early on, Jamaica, as I mentioned, and Poland. So you can, so what I wanted to say was in 1979, over 200,000 boat people, you might remember that language, boat people from Cambodia and Vietnam had drowned seeking refuge in the vast Atlantic Ocean. About 100,000 reached the US. And so again, that was what was going on. That was what was in the water. That was what was in the air at the time. And so it made it appealing to people as of our era who felt compelled to do something personally to help in some way marginalized people all over the world. Next slide, please. So how do we do this? Well, we're organized around what we call the essential services. And they take the form of 3 different areas. One is to eradicate hunger. The other is improving health. And they ladder up then to improving cognition, because we know that without the basics, a country's intellectual capability is really not able to grow at all, and is in fact what keeps other countries that do not have the basics of life, the essential services of life, to develop the full potential of their country's intellectual capacity. So we're very much focused on that. We're very much focused, as I said, on children. What have been our results? Well, you can go on to the next slide. I'm not going to go through everything because each country, of course, has their own success story. I will tell you the most ambitious program that we have done so far has been in Tanzania, where we've worked since 1986. And we have accomplished stunning impact there. For example, in the last 18, or not the last 18 months, but over 18 months, we were able to work with the Tanzanian families in what we call the Reaching Children's Potential program in 5 villages in the Ukwega ward, which is in the Iringa district in the highlands of Tanzania. And we've been able to reduce stunting, childhood stunting, by 57%, which is unprecedented in that area. And it's through the very close collaboration with parents who are trained through a number of areas, which I'm going to explain in a minute. It took more than a decade in all of Africa to accomplish what we were able to do in 18 months. How do we do that? Well, then just go on to the next slide, and I'll explain just a little bit. We did this by, next slide, please, Sophia. Thank you. So we did this primarily by raising the infrastructure to provide access to top-notch healthcare. So we were able to get a foundation grant to construct what you're seeing in the background there. It's a full campus, which includes surgery suite and, well, soon to be surgery suite, but a full hospital-like setting, general clinic, and maternal house, and also a food distribution center. We also help them, the families, learn about nutrition, protection from disease, and physical and mental development. We invest in technologies to grow micronutrients, obtain clean water. We teach them about safe stoves, optimizing hygiene enhancing self-sufficiency with chicken coops, and then also with women's co-ops in providing a number of services and economic opportunities in the communities. We provide fortified meals, emergency fortified meals for pregnant women, new mothers, and children under the age of 3. And we also distribute those fortified meals that we get in partnership with Rise Against Hunger in Tanzania. And we work with them to provide those meals to the schools that we work with in each of those 5 villages as well. Next slide, please. In addition to those kinds of work, that type of work that we do on the ground, providing essential services, providing the whole gamut of comprehensive development, we also provide conversational English, which in fact is the language of commerce, technology, and opportunity in 3/4 of the programs where we work. English for the people that we serve is literally a passport out of poverty for children and adults in the developing world and in emerging democracies. So it takes the form of tutoring and direct one-on-one work in K-12 classrooms. We also conduct summer English language camps in a number of service programs, notably in Eastern Europe and also in Greece. And then we conduct programs for college and university students, and sometimes that even includes teachers as well in the summer months or when they're out of classes. We provide one-on-one tutoring in English. An example is in Cuba, for instance. It's a good example where obviously English is taught in the schools, and it's true in all of the programs where we work. English is usually either the language of instruction or is taught in the schools, but in countries where the individuals need to have additional expertise in certain areas, we will provide one-on-one tutoring. That's true in Vietnam and in Cuba. And then we teach management and business English. And I just mentioned Vietnam. One of the places where we work is a program for researchers and leaders in the Vietnamese bureaucracy in Hanoi. And so they give us examples of what they need to learn. And then we conduct workshops around those topics. Next slide, please. So why Minnesota? Well, what I can say, I think, is a little bit the same as what the 2 preceding presenters said, and that is Minnesota is consistently above average in corporate and individual giving. It's also above average, way above average in volunteerism. Minnesota also tops other states in the number of nonprofit employees that are employed in business here and in commerce. And everybody, I think, knows, at least those people who were presenters today know about Give to the Max Day. It was a uniquely Minnesota invention. And we like to call it our unofficial giving holiday. And we always raise record amounts of donations. And so I think, again, it's just the generosity of the people here. It seems to be in our DNA, and certainly is a driving force behind the boomer generation, which I think has remained very, very engaged in volunteerism and human rights and peace, waging peace, promoting justice worldwide since our teen years. And thank you for that. I look forward to any kind of questions you might have.
Waging peace. I love that.
Indeed.
Yeah, terrific. Thank you so much. So I'd like to ask each of you, and I invite the audience. I've been monitoring the chat box. We don't have any unanswered questions in the chat. Feel free to pop them in there, but I'm going to lead off, and Todd, I'm going to invite you to think of questions you in your back pocket as well. But I'd like to hear from each of you. Let's start with you, Jennifer, about any advice that you have for our audience who wants to get involved in learning more about other cultures or meeting folks from other countries or being involved in international affairs. What do you think, what opportunities are out there for folks that you'd point them to?
I think there are a lot of opportunities. I mean, obviously, you can go to the websites of our three organizations, as all of us have volunteer opportunities. But I think there's also a lot through religious organizations. We do a lot of work with different churches and synagogues and so forth, and make connections with asylum clients and so forth. So I think it's just taking that step to volunteer. There are a lot of volunteer opportunities. We talked about Watch. In the course, we also have an immigration court observer project. So there's short term, there's long term, but I think it's just a matter of doing a little research and taking the chance.
Well, thanks for that. Eden, why do you think it's important for Minnesotans to care about international or global affairs? Why do you care about global affairs?
Sorry, was that question directed at me?
It was,
Oh,
yes.
I'm so sorry. You cut out on my end a little bit.
Yeah. No, I mean, why do you think it's important to care about global affairs? Why do you care about global affairs?
Well, I mean, global affairs are the affairs of all of us. I think the concept that we are separate or other from anybody just because they're geographically in a different place than we are is, if not an old-fashioned idea, completely irrelevant. I think that what's happening around the world has a direct and an indirect impact on all of us. And, we're all together in this human endeavor. So I think being informed and trying to be a part of the solution to problems as much as you possibly can is the responsibility of all of us, honestly.
Thanks for that. Michelle, how about you? What would you say about why it matters to be?
Well, I was just going to hop on what Aiden said. Yeah, I think, we can all be part of the problem, or we can be part of the solution. And particularly now, I think we all are focused on what is some of the most serious crises I've seen in my lifetime in the world. And I think it would be impossible, I feel, to live without an eye to what is happening in the world and feeling responsible in some way to take action. So that's why I care, because global affairs, as Aiden so eloquently said, impacts all of us. And I'm happy that Global Volunteers does give an outlet to people to make some contribution. In fact, that was one of the things that my husband, and when we were talking just today about, the recent atrocities in Israel, and I was, just really kind of despondent about the whole thing. And he said, well, Michelle, we just can't forget that we do make a difference, and it may not be in Israel at the moment. We do work with Ukrainian refugees in Poland, for instance. And so it gives me a great deal of comfort to know that it's, you do your little part.
Thank you for that, Michelle. Jennifer, what would you add about why you think it's important to be globally minded?
Well, boy, I think that they have really encapsulated my thoughts pretty well. I think it is important to think about us as an interconnected community, and that's even more true now with technology. And the world is becoming a smaller and smaller space, and so what happens in another country impacts us here. But I also think that we can really benefit from those connections, benefit from interacting with people from different countries, from different cultures. My daughter is actually, right before this, I was FaceTiming with her. She's taken a gap year in Norway, which is not a tremendously different culture, but it still is a different language and a different different experience. So just all that she's learning about herself now that she's she's outside of the United States. So I think that there can be some personal benefits to making those connections and seeing what's the same and what's different, and really kind of cherishing all of that.
Go ahead, Todd.
I want to ask, Jennifer, you raised a basic point. The three of you are working in unbelievably successful projects. You're working in a process where often we are able to deal with 1% or 2% of the world's needs. Two aspects to this. How do you magnify the efforts of what you're doing? Because I know all of you have thought about this because the results are so good. And secondly, what has the process done to you personally? Since you began, what changed in your life in terms of learnings?
I'll take the second question first and just say that, I probably couldn't do this work if I weren't an optimist, but in some ways, it really is just such a privilege to be able to work with the human rights defenders that I work with in other countries, and also with the asylum clients that I've worked with. Just the incredible, the spirit, the ability to overcome, and the resilience, and the courage, and the humor, and the faith, and it's hard to encapsulate it into just a few words, but they're some of the most amazing people that I've met in my life, and so it really is a privilege to be able to walk alongside them. And then right now it's a bad moment for human rights in the world right now. But I've been doing this long enough to see, that the arc of the universe really does bend towards justice. So I do really believe that. So that's one of the takeaway. And LGBTIQ plus rights is one thing that I would just add. And actually, that's an area where, there's been tremendous change just in my career. And women's rights is another, and that's an area where, it wasn't even recognized. Human rights organizations weren't working on women's rights in the early 90s. It wasn't recognized as a human right, which is shocking. But anyway, so there are areas where I definitely see it's a constant movement towards development for protection and promotion of human rights.
Well, I'm going to leap in, and because I'm looking at the clock, Todd, thank you for reminding us, Jennifer, that the arc is long, right? And this is a dim moment, but with perspective, we can see that we are making important progress, and it all depends on each of us to do our own part. So I just want to thank each of you. You guys were terrific tonight. I really enjoyed it. And Sophie, I'm looking at you. Thank you so much for making this possible. Todd, do you have any final words of wisdom for us?
Well, I don't know about wisdom. That's a separate issue. But I want to say thank you again to all of the presenters, and especially to our co-sponsors. I want to also mention that we have a program coming up on the role of museums in Ukraine in preservation of artifacts, led by the wonderful Mark Meister at the Russian Museum, and two of the top experts in the United States on this issue. And the information will come out very soon. So one of the last thoughts is the idea that we learn the concept of time and patience. All of us have worked in institutions that we didn't think were possible and provided frustrations on a daily basis, but somehow we had the patience to, as I described to somebody in terms of my own career, they told me it couldn't be done, but I was too dumb to listen. So I basically went out and did it. And so for all of you, thank you. And we appreciate it. And if people are looking for volunteer efforts in any of these organizations, please do it, because they're all good groups. Thank you, and have a good night. Take care. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Bye.
Thanks, Michelle. Have a good, hope everything goes well out there in Dakota.
Thank you
Take
all.
care. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Everybody.
Bye.